morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to Archon's Armies. Today we're doing the part 2 of our analysis of the legions. Once again, we're going into the theory craft. I've already done this page, so you could pause here and read again if you'd like, but we are going over legion pairings, which is a theory in the assumption build that every single legion was built with another paired legion or a brother legion that served the same purpose for the Emperor. Their combat purpose, which is their pre-Primarch modus operandi for combat, their political and peacetime purpose, another theoretical future version of what the Legion may have been used for if the galaxy was unified. Did they change with their Primarch coming, and their gene seed stability and numbers, and then their overall alignment or performance as a Legion when compared to the baseline of what Marines are good for. So we went over the first 10 Legions in our last video, and now we are continuing in order with the World Eaters, or the Warhounds, depending on what generation that you're talking about. Let's slip the Dogs of War. Their Legion pairing is one of the newer ones, one of the ones we haven't talked about yet, the aggressive line or siege breaker pairing. They are paired with the Death Guard, or more accurately, they're paired with the Dusk Raiders. Now, the aggressive line or siege breakers, they do sound a lot like some of the other pairings, but they are unique in the way that they are designed to attack specific types of targets, and to do so without much tactical humming and hawing. You might say, for example, that the assault units, or the more aggressive shock units, or even the asymmetrical units may be better at this job, but there are some legions, specifically the World Eaters and the Death Guard, who are just designed from the ground up and have their doctrine built around this idea that a little bit of attrition is okay when you're intending to overwhelm a target. Now, for the World Eaters, it's a particular combat style. Their goal is to maraud through an unprepared enemy, ostensibly to defeat an enemy that wasn't ready to fight them. Unfortunately, due to some deployment issues and the natural problem of no good plan facing or succeeding in the face of the enemy, this resulted in high casualties on both sides, because all that it really amounted to with the Warhounds was attacking at an unexpected time to a target that was reasonably unprepared to fight the Adeptus Astartes, and then attacking them with massive numbers along a large front, and if the enemy was ready, it would result in significant casualties. However, its sheer brutality and its vicious speed meant that the World Eaters could pretty effectively crush initial resistance, and then their continued aggressiveness would make it so that no retreat was really possible. One of the reasons why the World Eaters are so well known for not taking prisoners, because very simply, so many of them would die in the attempt to get through to the enemy defenses that they were not really in the mood for keeping any of the resistance alive afterward. So they have a bit of a simplistic way of war. It's very similar to the Space Wolves or to the other shock assault legions, but the difference here is that we're not talking about a combined arms pinpoint targeting where you leverage your mass against a single target. This is much closer to a World War I style, everyone lines up, and then we charge headlong full force at an enemy that wasn't aware that we were about to attack them. Because we are Marines, we can travel in mechanized transport or in very quick air transport, but at the end of the day, it is Marines on the ground, bolters and chainswords in hand, obliterating every target that they can. For a political or peacetime purpose, well, obviously politically they don't have much value, but for peacetime, I think they could have been meant as a chastisement force for human regiments. Now, this is a thing during the Heresy where they get a really negative reputation for purging elements within the Imperial Army, sometimes for unreasonable infractions. For example, they get a reputation as part of the Bloody 13th for routinely killing friendly soldiers, for perceived infractions or for not being up to the quality level that the Warhounds were wanting, or the performance level. Whether or not this was something that was built into their doctrine or just part of them being very competitive as warriors is not clear. But I think that maintaining a legion that was capable of doing that, for example, chastising human military forces, is reasonable, in my opinion. It would definitely be a good use case, but even if they were kept for that, it would be in relatively small numbers, likely only a couple of thousand, because you really only need one World Eater per regiment of humans in order for him to do his job. However, I think it is also very likely that if they had that bad of a reputation at the very beginning of the Great Crusade, it's more than likely that by the end of the Great Crusade, even without Angron's intervention, the Warhounds themselves would probably have been purged from existence, and there would be nothing left of them. They are one of the few legions that I actually think would not have survived a peaceful galaxy, mostly because they don't have much other purpose for the Emperor apart from that possible usage as a chastisement for the humans under his control. Sorry, just lit a candle. So, does the Warhound's tenor change with the arrival of Angron? I think anyone who knows anything about the Warhounds knows that the answer is demonstrably yes. We will talk about Angron at some length when we go over each of the Primarchs, hopefully a video soon to come here, but the really big thing to note about the Warhounds and Angron is that he does not approve of them all that much. Essentially, he views a lot of their ostentatious honor culture, their friendly competition as frivolous and, quite frankly, a little bit pathetic in comparison to the gladiatorial warfare that he was involved in from a very young age. And so, in a way, he very much hardens what had been a brotherhood into a brutal war machine. And the idea of the World Eaters getting decimated for not taking a planet quickly enough, or not slaughtering enough, soon became the tenor of the Legion, much more than just a little bit of chastisement and a reputation for being glory-hounded bad boys. So, Angron does change the Legion quite a bit, not even including the fact that he introduced the Butcher's Nails later on, which would spell the downfall of the entire Legion given a certain amount of time. So, yes, he does change the tenor of the Legion. Yes, he emphasizes the more attritional warfare, because, of course, if the Space Marines know that if they don't perform well enough, they will be chastised with decimation anyway, or with punishment and death anyway, and, of course, that their father does not give a single shit about them, because he is losing his mind. With that in mind, it changed the tenor of the Legion from kind of a boys night out type of Hail Mary fighting to a, well, I'm just going to murder people because I'm very angry that I have daddy issues kind of Legion. And it has kind of remained that up to modern 40k even. Honestly, the World Eaters at the end of the Heresy and the World Eaters in the modern day are not too dissimilar. However, a Warhound from before Angron's arrival and a Warhound from the end of the Heresy would be very different, or a World Eater from the end of the Heresy, rather. Gene Seed stability numbers. Interestingly enough, they have high numbers, even given their attritional nature. Of course, part of this comes down to the fact that they are deploying as Astartes. This is not humans employing these massive wave tactics, it's Astartes still, so they are relatively difficult to put down, and they're quite tough, not to mention that during the Heresy, if you had high stability Gene Seed and a little bit of casualty recycling ability, which Angron and his legion certainly do employ, to keep their legion at 150,000 warriors, it is not too unreasonable to think that the World Eaters might maintain that high of a number. It might also have to do with Nuceria having particularly well-built offspring to pull from as stock to make Warhounds, but that's not really a guarantee. At least they're better than our next Legion on the list in terms of the stock they had to pull from. So, What is their performance? I think it's medium low when deployed poorly. Essentially, if that mass single short attack or really long running battle that the World Eaters want to engage in, if that isn't organized well, essentially if they're in a location that isn't advantageous, if they don't get the surprise drop on their enemy that they're going for, if anything goes wrong with the plan, their performance is going to be greatly limited by their casualties and attrition, which is going to bring them down to medium low. But otherwise, it is medium because they are essentially doing classic Astartes tactics just over a wider area. So I think that if they planned well enough for it, and if they had maybe a little bit of luck on their side, they'll be even with any other legion, medium. So, the Ultramarines, the 13th Legion, the Warrior Kings of Ultramar. Everyone's either favorite or least favorite legion. Let's be honest, most people either really like or really, really dislike the Ultramarines. I think if you've been watching me for any amount of time, you will know good and damn well what I think of the Ultramarines, but let's continue. Legion pairings, they are traditional all-rounders, as you honestly might expect. It is their entire doctrine that they are basically all-rounders, but in my opinion, they are inferior to the Dark Angels at their own job, which is a little bit funny, honestly. Their combat purpose has changed over time. Nowadays, they're very much focused on being like the old-fashioned Dark Angels, with having lots of different assets of all different types and being able to do and adapt to almost any situation, with these near choreographed levels of squad tactical cooperation and capability. During the Heresy, they're not too far off from this, but that squad tactique, that choreographed battle, isn't quite the same yet. We're still talking about Marines in some of their earliest days. There are deficits to Marine armor, to Marine tactics, and to Marine weaponry that are slightly hashed out within the 41st millennium, or are less of a problem because they've been accounted for by centuries, if not millennia, of Marine training and development. So they're lacking a little bit of that, but what really puts the Ultramarines apart from the rest of their folks is they have massive cross-theater and deployment cooperation. Essentially, the Ultramarines are very reliable to be in large numbers, to interoperate with other forces, and to work well with their allies, which is not a guarantee, especially with a lot of legions like the Warhounds or like the Death Guard or the Iron Warriors. They don't necessarily work well with others, so to speak, whereas the Ultramarines work very well with others. Honestly, quite a bit like the Emperor's Children in terms of inter-theater cooperation and interoperability, but they also have it baked into their doctrine that they can do this with a lot of different forces, particularly with the Imperial Army. The political or peacetime purpose, I think that they would continue their organization, but only as a defense for the self-contained Ultramar war machine that they developed during the Heresy. So if you're not aware, Ultramar, a series of planets around Macragge, which is where Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, is found, eventually develops into its own little subcutaneous empire within the Imperium of Man, and it is what really supplies the Ultramarines with all of their gear, equipment, aspirants, technology, ammunition, etc., and it also becomes kind of their fallback position and their defensive bulwark when the Heresy kicks off. They are very attached to Ultramar as a diktat sub-empire, Guilliman's home turf, and they develop it during the Heresy into a genuine war machine, giving them the ability to supply one of the largest legions in the 41st millennium, intentionally out of their backyard. So I think that even if they were cut down dramatically, which is very likely given the size of the Legion, I think that they will still be maintained as traditional legionaries, maybe in 5 or 6 companies, so 20, 30,000 Marines, to defend the realm of Ultramar and to keep the war machine running so that it can provide for the rest of the Imperium the way that it did for them during the Heresy. So I think that's reasonable. Do they change with their Primarch, or did their Primarch use them for something other than the Emperor's design? I think that this doesn't apply for Guilliman in 30k. Obviously, in 40k, we know that both the loss, the arrival, the works, and the eventual decisions of Guilliman will change the tenor of the Ultramarines to a greater or lesser degree, depending on how closely you want to read into their chapter's changes. But during the Heresy, I would argue that there is not much change for the Ultramarines when they have Guilliman outside of Ultramar becoming their home. So outside of Ultramar becoming the most important thing to the Legion and it being central to their doctrine and their realm of expansion during the Crusade, I would say there's not much of a difference between pre-Guilliman Ultramarines and post-Guilliman Ultramarines. Gene Seed stability in numbers, it is high, with high stability, and a massive legion size of 250,000, putting them up there with some of the largest legions in the 41st millennium. And this is combined with the Ultramar War Machine, like I mentioned, providing them both quick growth and replenishment at an insane rate. This is an entire set of Tithe and Fief worlds, which essentially work directly and primarily to keep the Legion prepared and refilled, which means that they can essentially double up and triple up on some other legions in terms of size and equipment because they have an entire pocket empire working to supply them. Overall alignment or performance as a legion, they are about as medium can get. They are never particularly outstanding outside of the realm of Ultramar. Once removed from their logistical network and once forced to expend themselves beyond their own borders, so to speak, they're not any more impressive than any other legion, and they use fairly standard, traditional, all-rounder battle tactics. So, medium. I genuinely don't think that they are the equals of the first. And I do think that as individuals, and particularly within their within a one-to-one comparison with the Dark Angels during the Heresy, I think the Ultramarines are inherently inferior, because while the Ultramarines do have a lot of different assets and they are very flexible, the Dark Angels have a lot of hard assets and they are very talented, specialized, and veteran, which I think you know that if you compare, what is it, youth and enthusiasm will always lose to old age and treachery. And what is also very important is be afraid of any old man in a job where young men die. I see that very much with the comparison between the Dark Angels as all-rounders and the Ultramarines as all-rounders. So I think that within Ultramar you could definitely put them up to high in terms of being much more logistically capable and more organized. Again, this is like not including Guilliman, obviously, but he is the heart of the logistics for the Legion, but he's also focused on Ultramar. So outside of Ultramar, without that network of supply, or if it was still developing, I would say that they only rank a medium in terms of alignment with Legion tactics. The Death Guard, or the Dusk Raiders of Barbarous, which, this is a really nice picture here. I think that, yeah, this is a Dusk Raider because he's got the red arm. So, Legion pairing, these ones are also paired with the World Eaters or the Warhounds. They are aggressive line or siege breakers. Most accurately, the Death Guard were designed to be siege breakers. You may hear me say designed, and that's because Mortarion completely changes the function of the Legion. Basically does a 180 on that whole besieging thing, and makes them a whole lot closer to a cross between the Iron Warriors and the Warhounds than they were originally. So, their combat purpose is victory through surprise and attrition. Essentially, show up unexpectedly with a lot of weight and then pour it on. One of the big things that sets the Death Guard apart from the World Eaters or the Warhounds is their use of mechanized assets, support weapons, and artillery. As compared to the World Eaters or Warhounds, they are much more inclined to use heavy weapons, artillery, and siege tactics, even while they are engaging in this high aggression, deep penetration, intense fight that is more accurate to how the World Eaters operate. At least that was their original plan. Mortarion makes a slight modification to that, but it is let's say, a little bit unrealistic, much like people consider the Iron Warriors to be like trench diggers and sitters behind walls and that kind of stuff. The Death Guard became more of that with Mortarion. Before that, they were very, very interested in catching the enemy off guard with early morning, night attacks, aggressive, heavy mechanized pushes, all these different tactics that were more like these aggressive siege breakers or line breakers than the eventual slogging trench warfare legion that they would become under Mortarion. Now, why exactly that was the change and whether it made them better or worse, I will not really judge, because of course the Death Guard are the Death Guard. They are very much related to Barbarous, and that changes the tenor of the Legion when the Barbaran Marines and the Terran Marines come into contact. There is a lot of disagreement between how these two forces should get along and whether or not they would accept one another, because of course the Terran Marines were perceived as being a little bit snobby to the Barbaran Marines because Barbarous is an absolute disgusting hellhole. But I go to beyond the political and peacetime purposes of the Death Guard. I think that these would likely be kept in chapter size, so several thousand, to fill in behind more capable infiltration forces a la the Alpha Legion. Essentially, what would happen is a more specialized, more talented force would break open or weaken a defensive area, and then the Dusk Raiders or the Death Guard would go and fill in behind them and provide the weight that those infiltrator legions don't have. So, that doesn't mean that they're like cannon fodder in the future. It means more that they are more numerous but less nuanced, as they are aggressive siege breakers rather than asymmetrical warfare experts like the Alpha Legion. Do they change with their Primarch? Yes. It is fairly obvious at this point that Barbarous itself changes the tenor of the Dusk Raiders. The Dusk Raiders originally were very aggressive. They were very siege breaker oriented. They didn't really have this whole heavy, attritional, slow, dig into trenches warfare thing. That wasn't their primary. That was like a fallback option. With Mortarion, it became the primary. And to a degree, this was similar to Perturabo. It was supposed to be an embrace the suck type moment where he doesn't think that they're tough enough because they haven't lived through the poisonous atmosphere of Barbarous. They haven't sucked in the same venomous poison or fought the same war against the necromancers that Mortarion and his warriors had, so he wanted to harden the Legion and harden their outlook. The difference here is that he did it essentially via taking their tactics and making them worse, rather than taking the Legion and punishing them for not living up to his expectations, like Perturabo did. So it was a different thing, and in my opinion, it made the Death Guard inherently worse at their job, which is why I put them at medium-low in terms of alignment. Very simply, what Mortarion does that changes the tenor of the Legion, how he modifies their combat doctrine, makes them just frankly worse at their job as Marines, and while it may toughen them up, it certainly hardens their outlook, no question. You know, we're getting to the point where Marines are drinking poison and toasting to Mortarion's health because our father is proud of our struggle. Like some real kicking the cat and it comes back to you kind of stuff within the Death Guard. But of course there is that stark division within the Dusk Raiders that comes from the difference between the Barbaran Marines, who are closer to Mortarion, and the Terran Marines, who are closer to other Marines. So it's a very unique aspect there, and I think it makes much more of a social impact on them than a combat doctrine impact. But Mortarion, of course, does make the combat change. They number only 95,000, which could be multiple factors. On one hand, there's the increase in the attrition part of their surprise and attrition strategy, so that deep battle becomes much slower, and as a result, many more Dusk Raiders or Death Guards will die. However, the other thing is that there is, while his gene seed may be stable, or relatively stable, it might be limited in effectiveness because of the stock that he gets from Barbarous. Barbarous is a horrible, poisonous hellhole, and the people who live on it are pretty much no better than the average civilized world, and they're certainly not the big imposing brutes that we would expect from Marines generally. And that could cause the result of many of the early Death Guard kind of aspirants not producing or not becoming full Marines as easily, which would easily lead to a lower number of Marines overall. And like I said, with the changes to their doctrine, they really only rank medium low. And as the siege breakers, their use of mechanics such as like heavy vehicles and artillery is good, but since they pretty much only use it to its highest effectiveness before Mortarion shows up, I only give them a medium low rating. The Thousand Sons, the Spawn Legion, the Cursed Legion, Magnus's Red Children. They are the only Psychic Legion. They are paired with the Second Legion per our theory. That implies that the Second Legion, which was purged, was likely corrupted by chaos when the Emperor attempted to use their gene seed and or found their gene sire, and the result was that they were purged. The Thousand Sons, on the other hand, had their own problems in the flesh change, and that was problematic, but it was relatively solved by the coming of Magnus and his attempts to stabilize whatever was wrong with his gene seed. Was he successful? Partially. But, yeah, I say the Spawn Legion because that's quite apt for what would happen to the Legionaries before Magnus's arrival. The Thousand Sons is in reference to how few of them there were. So, combat purposes, they essentially combine psychic capability with standard Astartes tactics in various ways. Whether that's working together to cast spells as a unit and that effectively acting as their special weapons, whether it's using arcane abilities to enhance their combat capabilities, prescience, incredibly high speed, teleportation, any number of these things they're capable of doing, but their more powerful librarians or sorcerers are capable of much, much more destructive magic, and entirely on their own. Now, this is a very unique way of doing warfare, and we don't see it outside of the heresy, so there's a lot of limitations on what I can actually say about how the Thousand Sons would operate on a squad tactic basis, but it is obvious to say that one of the big advantages that they have is that whatever they were able to do as Marines, which I would in no way say that the Thousand Sons are bad Marines. They really aren't, until later when they start relying on their psychic powers more, or rather too much. Then they start to degrade in terms of their tactical basics, but up until that point, they were very capable as Marines. There was nothing really holding them back doctrinally, and their psychic powers were just cherries on top of what was already a very capable, if afflicted, legion. What is their political and peacetime purpose? Well, I think that they would probably fill in for the God Emperor's current use of Imperial sanctioned psychers. Whether that was having the Thousand Sons stand in as combat psychers, or having them take the place of logistical psychers within their network, or maybe even to take the place of other more very specific psychers like astropaths and navigators, I would only be speculating, but I genuinely do think that if the campaign had been successful, if humanity were unified in a peaceful galaxy, the Thousand Sons would be kept at relatively high numbers, and they would simply stand in for Imperial Psychers. Why is that? Well, it's for two reasons. One, it would be to have the Astartes take the place of mutants. Essentially, these mutants that live among us, these mutants that are dangerous from birth, we can now have no problem killing them all off and purifying them from humanity, something that the Emperor did like, even though he was a psyker. They could take their place because there was no negative concept before the Council of Nicaea about Astartes psychers. There was some concern, especially with how the Thousand Sons were progressively turning into chaos spawn over time, but apart from that, there was more pragmatism in relation to psychic powers during the heresy. So I think that's a role they could have filled. Do they change with their Primarch's arrival? Well, like I said, the Thousand Sons were suffering from the flesh change, which caused continuous degradation over time. In my opinion, getting them to the level of Chaos Spawn after a certain use of their powers, or a certain amount of time using their powers, it wasn't great. It definitely limited their numbers, and it made it very difficult for them to maintain high numbers. But the arrival of Magnus just in time saves the last few thousand of his sons that can be saved, and he goes through all this process to try and rebuild the Legion, and he is eventually successful with perhaps some intervention from forces unknown, shall we say. So, doctrinally, Magnus uses his ability with the Tizkin kind of mentality of, well, psychers are everywhere, psychers are normal. He kind of introduces the Legion to this idea that you should be training and practicing a lot more to be much better with your powers. Essentially, he nurses them from using psychic powers as a secondary to a primary occupation within their doctrine. And this makes a large difference on how they fight. Again, until they start relying on it heavily, their Legion battle tactics are on par with every other Legion because they have to be. They're not necessarily as talented or as capable until they have access to Prospero's vast wealth of knowledge, to Tiska in particular, but until that point, they're still relying on standard Legion battle tactics, with the occasional augmentation of psychic powers. With the arrival of Magnus, however, oh good golly, does that change really quickly, and they become incredibly talented at alloying their decent, or very, very good in many cases, Astartes battle tactics with their high level of psychic acuity and their powers. In numbers, they are relatively low, with only 85,000 Marines at peak. And the flesh change, like I mentioned, was spawnifying them over time. Magnus eventually manages to stabilize it, and then by the end of the heresy, Azek Ahriman fucks it up again, and we now have the Rubric Marines. Thanks a lot, Ahriman. Go get hit by a bus. So, what is the overall alignment or performance as a Legion? Well, you may expect me to say that it's low because they use psychic powers, but as I've alluded to several times during this slide, it's actually relatively high. And I've put it as high essentially because they take regular standard Marine tactics and then augment them with psychic powers. During a majority of their time as a Legion, this is what they do. It's only at the very end, when they become more reckless, more powerful, their sorcerer cabals at the top of the chain of command become much more aggressive with the idea of using powers to save themselves, that they kind of move away from traditional battle tactics. Now, does Magnus fight with traditional tactics? No. But as a whole, and especially during the time when he was using them as a traditional Legion before the Council of Nicaea, they were very much a talented Legion using standard tactics to high effectiveness, and then they had psychic powers on top of them. So I almost consider the Thousand Sons of the Horus Heresy before Magnus to be an equivalent to the Blood Angels of our modern day. They're not particularly impressive in any one location. They're just very solid as a Legion overall, and they have this special little quirk that they eventually develop into a much more powerful tactic, and of course it will eventually become their undoing. The Luna Wolves, the Sons of Horus. Their Legion pairing is another new one. They are an Ideology Legion, or an Ideologue Legion, and they are paired, unsurprisingly, with the Wordbearers, or the Iconoclasts, depending upon which era you're talking about. The Luna Wolves are, again, one of those controversial legions where you either love them or hate them. I am a little bit of an odd duck, because I don't necessarily love or hate them. I don't really despise them in any way necessarily. I certainly do dislike many legions, but the Luna Wolves really aren't one of them. And I don't really love them either. I mean, they're fairly bog standard. I do like many of the characters within there, Garvia Loken and all those folks, but they're not really up my alley as much. But they are a very interesting legion as an Ideology Legion. What is the point of an Ideology Legion? What's their combat tactics? They are mascot Legionaries. They are a picture-perfect legion. They are intentionally not allowed to lose because the Emperor is right there serving with them, and then eventually the War Master is serving with them. So they're not a show legion. I often get this thing said about the Luna Wolves that they're a show legion. All of their successes are heightened and their failures are buried so that they can never look like they've messed up at all, which, you know, their combat record being as checkered as every other legion, they're not perfect. But that's also not to say that they're bad at their job. As mascot legionaries, as individuals who are supposed to embody the brotherhood, the loyalty, the fierceness, and the capabilities of the Astartes, they're almost like a legion playing at being the Dark Angels, essentially. They're playing at being this all-rounder, high-capability, high success record legion, but they're not nearly as old, they're not nearly as impressive, and they're not nearly as large as some of the founding legions like the Dark Angels. So they're not allowed to lose. That's an interesting thing, because of course the Emperor himself does serve with the Luna Wolves for a large amount of time. And you will notice that many of their files or their combat records from this period of time are listed as essentially a chain of unbroken successes. And yet we know from the books that Horus and his sons as well come up against many very dangerous, very deadly enemies that they're not necessarily 100% successful against, especially when they move out away from the Emperor and they're no longer in the limelight anymore. Well, this is part of that phenomena that people have when they call them a show legion. Now, that's not to say that they're bad at their job. It's not to say that they are in any way toy soldiers, but they are treated as if they were in some cases. So they're expected to be perfect, and any mistakes that they make are honestly downplayed to a degree. And while that is expected to some degree, it's also dangerous, because it does give the Luna Wolves a very inflated sense of self. And in addition to that, it also gives them a lot more leeway when it comes to doctrine and organization, as long as they can justify it. For example, the warrior lodges, while being Erebus's idea, they ring very well in the Luna Wolves' ear, because all they have to hear is brotherhood, fairness, and openness, and they go, well boy howdy, let's put that in the Legion. So, combat purpose, essentially they work like the all-rounders. They copy out with a lot of their tactics, but they do it in a much more showy, much more professionalism-focused manner, instead of being pure effectiveness-focused. That is the political and peacetime purpose. Like I said, as this mascot legion, as this ideology legion representing the best of the Astartes, even if that's not necessarily true, they are likely to be the only standing legion left in the Imperium at full strength during peacetime. So in my opinion, in a post-30k world where the heresy doesn't happen, Horus is still War Master, and the Luna Wolves are the only legion still numbering over 100,000 legionaries. Essentially, they become the battle line for the Imperium as a whole. They are the most effective, most dangerous, most advanced, and most capable army in the entire galaxy, numbering 100,000 strong of battle-ready veteran sons of Horus. So, that's a pretty impressive job, and honestly, I do think that the Luna Wolves are the best pick for this, because the only thing separating their combat doctrine from that of one of the best legions, the Dark Angels, is time. They have the equipment, they have the drive, they have the willingness, they have the reputation. All they're missing is the veterans, and that will come with time. So, do they change based on their Primarch? Well, not really all that much, and you might think, well, they go from being Luna Wolves to being Sons of Horus, and then eventually to being, Black Legionaries. But that's not happened just yet. We're talking 30k here, of course. Their tactics do change a little bit. At least they become much more the mascot legionaries once Horus is made War Master. Now, this is partially because Horus is beloved, and people often forget this, especially when they're talking about heresy lore, that Horus is one of the most beloved sons of the Emperor, not just by the Emperor himself, but also by his brothers. And as a result of this, as a result of Horus becoming a go-between between many of his more argumentative and problematic siblings, the Luna Wolves share a similar doctrine and ideology, one that eventually gets used by Erebus to set up the warrior lodges, but apart from that little unfortunate detail of Erebus being a massive piece of shit, it is generally good to be able to get along with the people that you work with, and the Luna Wolves, much like the Ultramarines, have that ability. The Ultramarines have more hang-ups in many cases than the Luna Wolves do, and the Luna Wolves are usually welcome on most battlefields because, well, it usually means that you're about to get some serious reinforcement from one of the most high-profile legions in the galaxy. So other than that, not much. Gene seed stability and numbers. They have a high reliability rating with their gene seed, but it does give them a very strong resemblance to Horus. It's another one of those gene seeds that seems to overhaul the genome of the Astartes to a much higher degree than other gene seeds. And it is unclear why they're kept at this 130 to 170k range. It might be because they're engaging in large-scale warfare on a consistent basis. In comparison to some legions, they're at the very forefront of the crusade for a very long period of time. It could also be that they break up and serve with other legions, so splitting the Luna Wolves into two equally large semi-companies, or semi-legions, so to speak, might be more advantageous or more attritional to do that. It might keep them at a lower readiness number, but overall, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with Horus's gene seed from the offset. I've put their overall alignment with the Legion performance as medium to high. Again, it's difficult to tell if they're good, or if Horus is just that good, or if there are other factors like that toy soldier theory, where they're not allowed to lose because the Emperor is right there, and whatever happens, the Emperor's never going to lose because he's the Emperor. So, medium to high, I think you could argue high, I think you could argue even higher than high at the very height of their power, but at the same time, there is always that kind of thing in the back of your head where you're like, are they really that good? Are we being lied to about their performance? Is it true? Is it not true? Because all of their named characters are very good at specific things. They're very good duelists, they have an impressive capability with much of their technology, but at the same time, how do they compare with the average Luna Wolf or Son of Horus? It's very difficult to tell. Moving on to one of the more infamous legions, and honestly one of my favorites. Not top 5, or sorry, not top 3, but maybe top 5. Legion pairings. This is the other ideology legion with the Luna Wolves, and unlike the Luna Wolves, where it was more of a metaphorical ideology of them being the golden example of what a legion could be, the Iconoclasts, or the Wordbearers, are ideological in the more straightforward destruction of public property way. The goal of the Wordbearers, or really the goal of the original Iconoclasts before the coming of Lorgar, was the destruction of important iconography or important religious or cultural icons of planets. So they were like a discount version of the Night Lords. They would identify things that were against the goal of the Emperor's primordial truth, aka that there are no gods, and they would obliterate them completely and intentionally with the goal of breaking the enemy's resistance and, more importantly, stamping out any last vestiges of faith that they may have espoused. You know, if you're fighting on your planet and all of a sudden the church that you were trying to defend gets obliterated by a bunch of gray-clad monsters wielding bolt guns and flamethrowers, yeah, you might start to think that your gods have abandoned you, and then after a couple of years of this, you probably have it quite bluntly confirmed to you that your gods either didn't exist or they didn't help you very much. And that was the whole point of the iconoclast as a legion. They didn't really have a combat role so much as a semi-morale focused combat target. What is their peacetime purpose? I think an interesting idea for the Wordbearers would be that they remain as commissars to the legions, essentially acting as a guiding force in peace. So they would go around much like the Inquisition of the Ordo Hereticus does, and they will go into societies that once had religious ties, and they will ensure that whatever ties they once had are well and truly severed, both via more traditional dialogue, speaking, doctrinal convincing, and changing of the culture, using your words, and then, of course, by the more classic breaking a priest's neck and blowing his brains out with a bolt gun. Both of them, they work as both. The Commissar of the Imperium in future. That's what I think the Wordbearers would have eventually become, which would have kept them in relatively small numbers, probably only a squad or two per planet, but also, they have to spread out amongst a whole bunch of planets. I wouldn't find it unreasonable if there were even 2 or 4 or even 6,000 Wordbearers left over after the heresy to maintain and complete this task. Do they change with their Primarch? It's frickin' Lorgar. Yes, they change. They change dramatically for the worse. They go from compliance in a relatively short amount of time, being relatively successful in stomping out religion, to trying to cause the God Emperor to become a religious icon, and trying to elevate their father and their father's ideas to the central religion of a imperium that he was trying to mold in a different way than the Emperor had planned. Essentially, Lorgar's obsession with organized religion did not jive well with the iconoclast's whole goal of destroying every form of organized faith, belief, and religion. However, Lorgar is such an insanely good speaker, such a good preacher, and more importantly has the literal ability to mentally and emotionally dominate his sons via the connection of the gene seed, that he was able to modify their combat tactics towards different ends. In the case of spreading an imperial truth style faith, that was, of course, there are no gods, but, the God Emperor is here, and he's definitely not a god, but you should worship him like a god, because he's definitely a god. I promise. Don't tell anyone I told you that, but he's a god. It's a strange change, but it fits the Wordbearers quite well. And then eventually, in First Heretic, they go full loco, and, well, I'll let you read that book for yourself, because it is a good one. One of my favorites. So, gene seed and stability. The detail is fuzzy. I personally think that they're on the high end with 150,000, but the numbers do say 100 to 150,000. It's questionable, but depending on the numbers, they say at Calth they were equivalent to the Ultramarines who were there. Whether that was the entire legion of 250,000 Marines, or whether it was just a small portion of it, the portion that wasn't in Ultramar at the time, is unclear. I think if the Wordbearers were up to 150k, and the Ultramarines were down 50k, and of course the Wordbearers got a very nice jump on the Ultramarines, that would make them quote-unquote equivalent at Calth, the way that the lore says that they are. And it would make sense why they were so focused on getting a perfect surprise attack on Calth, because they were already outnumbered by 50,000 Marines, essentially. So they needed that edge. The overall alignment or performance as a legion is medium-low. They are limited by their specialty, their specific goal of destroying iconography, religious and cultural icons, but that's not really a Astartes-aligned goal. Yes, it can work like the Night Lords, decreasing morale, but it's not a direct effectiveness. Destroying someone's church will first make them angry, and then eventually make them despair. The Night Lords, skinning somebody alive on national television is just going to provoke immediate despair. You can't really get angry at your friends and neighbors being flayed alive. That's kind of just horrifying enough that the human mind will shut off. In comparison to blowing up a church, for example, yeah, it makes a big difference. So they have kind of a secondary effect, but in my opinion, I think it takes away from the Astartes aligned goal, and that's why I give them medium-low alignment. So, let's move on. The Salamanders, our fearless dragon warriors. Gotta love the green boys. Definitely not my favorite legion, but I do understand why people like them a lot. They are artisans, paired with the Emperor's children, whereas the Emperor's children are connected with human beings via their artistry and their speech, poetry, and all their other beautiful things. The Salamanders are connected with human beings via physical artistry, smithing to be specific, and also gross design, so to speak. What is the combat purpose of the Salamanders? They have very good extermination and simplistic line work combat tactics. Now, on one hand, this is something that is kind of drawn from their choice of weaponry and their eventual combat doctrine. On the other hand, it aligns very well with how they use their weaponry and equipment. Each salamander is essentially customized by his own skill and ability, or by the skill and ability of his forge father in some cases. For this reason, they're not exactly designed to work together as a cookie-cutter, exactly the same unit. That's just not how the Salamanders operate. And of course, they are incredibly focused upon extermination tactics. Whether that's how they use fire, how they use more destructive units like radiation units, or whether that's just how they operate in combat, they have this very simple plan. Essentially, because each man is equipped to his own custom requirements, he has his own abilities and his own capabilities that he knows, that his squad knows, and that they each use to accomplish their own goal. For this reason, essentially modifying or spreading out the different ways that you can die when facing the Salamanders, it means that they have a very simple line work combat. Line work combat is essentially the idea that instead of stacking up or organizing to maximize firepower on a single point, they do the exact opposite. They break out, they separate, they line up, and they crush, burn, blast, and destroy their way through the battlefield in a very biblical destructive wave, rather than a more classic kind of organized military unit or squad tactics. The Salamanders are much simpler and much more brutally efficient in some cases. What is their political or peacetime purpose? Well, much like the other Artisan Legion, it's physical artistry, perfected handcraft, likely kept around in large but disparate numbers. Essentially, again, that idea of if the Mechanicus didn't show up to do their job, and the Iron Hands had to do it instead, the Salamanders would spread out amongst various industrial planets, and they would work on the ergonomics or the human side of production, development, and weapons design. Of course, the Iron Hands are very talented with their mechanics and their abilities, but they're not really as concerned with ergonomics as somebody who's more of a humanist like the Salamanders would be. And in my opinion, that artisan thing also extends to their love and protection of civilians. Because, of course, they have more connection with their own people, but I think that that's another thing baked into the artisanhood, that pairing, that they have more connection with their human roots. And I think that's what causes the Salamanders to be the way that they are. So, do they change with the coming of their Primarch? Well, it's difficult to tell. Probably not, in my opinion. Obviously, Nocturne changes how they look, how they act. Maybe it changes a bit of the culture of the Legion, but does it change their actual combat doctrine? In my opinion, no. Gene Seed stability, they are low to medium size with only 89,000 Marines, but they have one of those massive changes. Essentially, it darkens the skin, reddens the eyes, and massively modifies how the Marine looks underneath of the armor, no matter how he looked to begin with. With that said, they are relatively stable, which is odd given their low numbers. Now, it could be because Vulcan comes back to them a little bit later and takes some time away from the Legion before rejoining them. Perhaps they simply didn't have enough stock on hand, or otherwise they were limited in how they could reproduce when they didn't have Vulcan there. I doubt that's the case, but that is a possibility as to why their numbers are so low. It could also be the low population of Nocturne itself that limits their recruitment, but I'm not entirely sure about that. So I will leave that up to the Salamander fans, who both know a lot more and like the Salamanders a lot more than I do. The overall alignment is medium-low. Their combat is simple if effective, but it's not as good as some legions. They lack that interoperability piece, they lack any specialized tactics other than extermination tactics, and while the customization of their armor and equipment is good and helpful for personal combat, it does practically nothing for the overall effectiveness of the Legion as a whole. Masterworking is great, and it's great if everyone has masterworked equipment, but the Salamander's modifications to their armor and weaponry is not always to the masterwork level outside of their officerial core. So, for some people, that's going to be a disagreement. In that case, that's perfectly fine. Just put them at medium. I only put them at medium-low because of their lower numbers and their more disparate tactics in comparison to the Astartes standard. Speaking of my actual least favorite legion, I'm sorry, but it's the Raven Guard. The dust-clad nomads. I really will come out and say that I dislike the Raven Guard a lot. And I hate to say it, because they're paired with the Night Lords, and the Night Lords are my favorite. But yeah, I'll explain why I dislike them very, very quickly. They are the Peacekeeper Legion. Again, much like the Night Lords, their job is to prevent or keep certain seditious elements or dangerous elements that might be hard to approach from gaining any traction within the Great Crusade or within the later Imperium. Their specialized combat purpose is ultra-light surprise attack and combat infiltration, essentially using a Marine like a ninja. The idea is that they can infiltrate behind enemy lines, either on foot or with aircraft or other things, stealth fields, etc., and then using the lightest possible kit and equipment, they can take down enemy high-value targets, spring ambushes, effectuate assassinations, kidnappings, destruction of enemy equipment, and sabotage tactics. Essentially, the goal for their peacetime or political purpose would be to replace the assassins of the Officio Assassinorum. Their job is to kill the leaders of a rebellion, while the Night Lord's job is to kill masses of a rebellion. So let's say that there is a Chaos Uprising or some other rebellion on a planet. Let's say that the Severan Dominate came about in this peaceful universe after the Great Crusade is ended. What would happen is that a small group of the Raven Guard in their Officio Assassinorum groupings, let's say less than 1,000 of them, maybe even less than 100 of them, would be deployed to try and kill Duke Severus and his personal officials, while at the same exact time, about 5,000 or 6,000 Night Lords would be dropped down to terrify and destroy the civilian resistance. Essentially, one side cuts the head off the snake, the other side smashes the entire body with a sledgehammer repeatedly until it falls to pieces. So, in my opinion, in the peacetime version of the galaxy, the Night Lords and the Raven Guard work the same job, different shifts. Do they change with their Primarch? Does Corax change the Raven Guard? Quite a bit, actually. He pushes them much more into the idea of not only being heroes of the common man, as he likes to consider himself, kind of this liberator mentality, but he also emphasizes ultra-light armor styles, light combat gear, and moves away from more traditional Legion tactics of integrated warfare. Now, of course, he does rely heavily on aircraft warfare, and sometimes on light transit as well, but he mixes and matches a lot of things, including lighter marks of armor, lower grade equipment that isn't as heavy and doesn't make as much noise or cause as much of a scene, and it makes the Raven Guard overall stealthier. And this is my big gripe with the Legion as a whole. But we'll get to that in a second. The Gene Seed, they are incredibly low. There are likely inherent flaws within the Gene Seed of the Raven Guard. Whether this is something that is Korax's fault or something that is just part of his Legion as a whole is not entirely clear to me. However, there is something wrong with the Raven Guard Gene Seed that isn't as easy to fix or account for as the Blood Angels or the Space Wolves. So that's why they never really peak above 80,000 Marines, making them half the size of peak Night Lords, basically. Well, a little bit less than that, but 3/4 of the size. The overall alignment is medium-low. Again, you could argue medium, you could argue low, and I argue low, depending on how you interpret the doctrine. The thing that I dislike about the Raven Guard is it is explicitly stated in both their traditional lore and in their modern lore that they forego a lot of the heavier protection or the heavier marks of protection in Space Marine armor and some of the heavier weapons in exchange for being more stealthy. Now, I can understand in some situations and circumstances why that would help and why that would be a good idea. However, outside of very small teams of interceptors and assassins, which, of course, Marines are not the stealthiest creatures in the universe, and even Raven Guard Marines are still Space Marines. They're still 8 feet tall. They're still coated in half a ton of armor plating. And no matter how silent or non-reactive you make that stuff, it's still going to be giving off heat signatures, scent signatures, noises, all types of things that would trip a really good, or really even a decent sentry system. Because the Raven Guard have this doctrine at their core, and because, in my opinion, it interferes with the overall goal of the Astartes, which is to actually kill and destroy the enemy, and because it doesn't serve a secondary purpose. So, for example, people are immediately going to say, well, it's hypocritical to put the Night Lords so high and the Raven Guard so low when they essentially both rely upon stealth tactics. The difference is that the Night Lords have a massive set of backups to their sneak attack or surprise attack failing. They also don't rely upon concurrent sneak attacks. So the Raven Guard will go into an area and they will attack multiple targets at the same time, relying on each one falling like a domino in order for their overall plan to be effectively revealed. The Night Lords, on the other hand, will begin with one of these stealth attacks or sneak attacks for dramatic effect and to get maximum effectiveness out of their first strike capability, and then they will revert to being standard spooky Marines with a goal in mind. And that's the main issue that I have with the Raven Guard. The goal that they have in mind is that they can disintegrate the enemy's leadership and then destroy them using the most basic low-level Astartes tactics of being Space Marines. They're not particularly focused on any one or two doctrines or units, etc. Whereas, obviously, like I said with the Night Lords, the perfunctory surprise attack is exactly that. It's a formality with the Night Lords. It's an inherent requirement with the Raven Guard, because they don't necessarily have the same Legia Tactica under their belt as other legions do. And the Night Lords, in my opinion, are better, pound for pound, in terms of Legion Tactica, with vehicles, combined arms, specialty units, etc., in comparison to the Raven Guard. Both because they, again, cut down and pare down their tactics, strategies, and equipment to accomplish their first goal, but also, if that goal doesn't go well, they don't really have all these layers and layers of units and capabilities to fall back on, which is one of the reasons that I rank them as relatively low in the capabilities area. They don't have, in my opinion, as many layers and abilities, and their overall goal is highly reliant upon their first attempt actually succeeding. They do, very often, which, the darkness does love Korax and all that good stuff, but, again, for me, in comparison to other legions, I simply can't rank them as highly for that reason. The last legion, the Alpha Legion, the 20th, the many-headed Hydra. Again, I have many friends who are big Alpha Legion fans, and I don't want to do them too dirty, but they are on the asymmetrical warfare pairing. And they are paired with the White Scars, but they are very, very different, as you might imagine, in comparison to the White Scars. Their combat purpose is technical infiltration and replacement. Now, of course, the replacement thing with the Alpha Legion is a little bit overstated. They have limitations in where they can actually fit in. However, that infiltration works really, really well, and unlike the Raven Guard, they don't tend to sacrifice a lot of capabilities in order to achieve it. So the idea with tactical infiltration is much more focused on technology, security systems, and break-ins than it is on pure stealth alone. And of course, the Alpha Legion use some of the best stealth tactics available to the Raven Guard. They just don't sacrifice many or any of their capabilities or their operational goals in order to do so. And then, of course, the second thing is replacement. Alpha Legionaries pretending to be legionaries in other legions, or just soldiers in other forces in general, because they are a little bit smaller than average. Perfected political or peacetime purpose. I think it would be perfect to place that, or it would be also perfect, like the Raven Guard, for them to replace members of the Assassinorum, like the Calidus, or like the oh shoot, I'm losing the name. Starts with a V. Vindicare. Sorry. Forgot my assassins. Vindicare. But I think it's also very likely that they could act as an informant network within the legions. Essentially, with all these spread out units and all these different forces in different areas and places in the peacetime world like we've talked about, those disparate deployments, it would not be unreasonable to have the Alpha Legion essentially be a permanent embedded informant network, where they're moving around with all different legions, catching up on gossip, and returning back that information to the Luna Wolves, to the Emperor, to Horus, to whoever needs to get it back, to make sure that there's no deviance, disagreements, discussions, or confusion within the Legion itself. So, kind of acting as spies for the Emperor, kind of replacing those eyes of the Emperor, those retired custodies, something similar to that I could see the Alpha Legion doing in peacetime. Do they change with the arrival of their Primarch, or Primarchs rather? Well, like most things with the Alpha Legion, damn is it hard to actually say how they have changed or whether they have changed. Now, apart from their whole loyalty issue thing, whether they're loyalists or traitors, whether Alpharius or Omegon or whatever you want to say about their leadership is different, I don't think it actually changes their combat doctrine beyond them becoming involved with forces like the Cabal. So beyond that, beyond the upper level diplomacy of who they're working for and what they're working towards maybe changing, I don't think it changes their overall tactics. Of course, as they develop, they get better at replacement and their technical infiltration skills get better, but that's just to be expected, and I don't think you can apply that to Alpharius or Omegon as easily. Numbers. Now, it says they're either 180,000 strong or 90,000 strong. In my opinion, it's more likely to be 180,000. Both because it's unclear about the stability of the gene seed, but because it doesn't wreak as much of a change upon the aspirant. Alpha Legionaries are generally shorter than their other cousins, or their, fellow cousins, like their fathers are much shorter than the average Primarch. It means that there's less change, and theoretically that's going to cause less wear and tear on the Astartes body, effectively making it easier to make more Marines. I think the 180 versus 90 number might be in relation to that loyalist versus traitor thing, so I think it's much more likely that they're at the 180 mark than they are at the 90 mark. Overall alignment is, much like the Raven Guard as you could have expected, medium-low. It depends upon how you interpret the doctrine, but they're so much better in closed battle than they are in open battle, it almost seems like a waste for them to do traditional Astartes tactics. Now, that is not to say that that makes them better as a legion, or worse as a legion even, it's just to say that they don't align with the traditional job of the Astartes in the same way that the Raven Guard don't. Again, in my opinion, if you were to ask me who's the better spooky sneaky boys, I would say it's the Alpha Legion, because they have access to all the best things that the Raven Guard do, but they do it without sacrificing any of their tactical capabilities after the fact. But they're no Night Lords. They certainly don't have some high-level ulterior motive that supports the goal of being an Astartes. They kind of just do it because it's an easy way to achieve quote-unquote victory. So, here's our pairing list. The traditional all-rounders were the Ultramarines and the Dark Angels, that kind of jack-of-all-trades role. The cold industrialists are the Iron Warriors and the Imperial Fists, building, destroying, and reliant upon structures or support weapons. Peacekeepers, the Night Lords, killing people from the bottom up, and the Raven Guard, killing them from the top down for when the fighting is over or the fighting has begun behind your own lines. The Artisans, the Emperor's Children, and the Salamanders, perfected on and off the field. Asymmetrical warfare folks, the Alpha Legion and the White Scars, around or within the enemy. Aggressive siege or line breakers, the World Eaters and the Death Guard. Heads up, heads off, which is just how I put it when you're trying to jump into unexpected men's trenches and give them a chainsword in places they don't like to have it. The two solo legions, the Psychic Legion, the Thousand Suns, paired with the Second Legion. Good old Spawn or Source Legions. The Solo Mechanicus Legions, the Iron Hands, and the 11th Legion. Malkarian, again, there's some theories about the 11th Legion Primarch. There was some detail about a Malkarian the Red or some other related theories, but as far as I know, those are not canonical, so I'm not going to mention them in this video. Feel free to look them up if you want. Fast attack legions, the Blood Angels and the Space Wolves. Wolves, fast attack, jump troops, and assault troops, with very specific goals in mind, either disparate or focused enemies to set them apart from the aggressive line and siege breakers. And then, of course, the two ideological crusaders, the Sons of Horus and the Wordbearers Legion. They are the Emperor's Chosen Legion and the oh-so-important Iconoclast to help out with the Emperor's overall goal and ideology of the new galaxy. Whew! That is part 2. It is so good to get back to making videos again. I know I'm going to have to take a couple of days off here to finish up my work, but it has been such a pleasure to get content out to you guys again that wasn't just streams. I know those are kind of limiting for people, and believe me, I'm aware that they're not very fun to watch back. I hope you all did enjoy the art stuff, though. Feel free to go take a look at that, and I have some of it on my Instagram as well. But apart from that lovely thing, I'd like to shout out again, I do have all of our artwork here, so we can do a celebration video maybe at some point, or when I do my Nadzabar lore videos, we will have the artwork there as well. The next videos up on the docket, I will start posting out more posts with options and voting for you guys once more, but that will probably take a couple of days and maybe another video or so. We'll be going over more stuff about the 40k Primarchs and characters, combat abilities, armor designs, all different types of detail work like that. It will be a similar kind of format to this video where we go legion by legion, Primarch by Primarch, character by character, analyzing where they sit, how good they are, what talents they may have, and what equipment they may have, and how they would likely use it, or how they canonically use it. So, with that said, it's been such an absolute pleasure, and I wish you all a lovely good night.